everyone in the room decided on a plan of action in this framework. You know, families are not looking for us to have another conversation about the issues that have impacted them.
There are few issues more sensitive in the country than the issue of missing and murdered Aboriginal women. We often hear that this is a national tragedy, but that's false. A tragedy is something that's accidental. Any murder is an outrage, but all the more so when the person murdered is someone with particular vulnerabilities. Now, many will say that we need a national public inquiry for this issue. The Conservative government has declined to hold an inquiry, but last week held a national roundtable in Ottawa, where they dared to suggest that domestic violence was part of the problem. This was, of course, met with media outrage and accusations that they were, quote, blaming the victims. But maybe it's time we look at some of the harsh truths on the matter. Between 1980 and 2012, nearly 1,200 Aboriginal females went missing or were murdered. Over the same 33-year period, over 6,500 women in total were murdered. Again, every one an outrage. And while the number of murders for the total population has gone down over the last few decades, trend lines of Aboriginal murders haven't followed. The result is that Aboriginal women are overly represented in all murders. 16% of all murders in Canada are perpetrated against Aboriginal females, a, quote, significant overrepresentation. This is undeniable. So what do we know about these murders? Well, the RCMP released an extensive report last year. Here's a startling fact that you probably haven't heard in the media coverage. 90% of these women knew their killer. 50% were related to them. Nearly 30% were murdered by their husbands. Another 33% were murdered by another family member or boyfriend. And 30% murdered by an acquaintance. In fact, only 8% of the offenders of Aboriginal women were strangers. But what are facts when outrage is at play? Watch this clip from Sunday's CTV question period.
The Minister for the Status of Women said that a large part of the problem lies with Indigenous men, that it's the men from their Aboriginal communities who are responsible for violence against so many First Nations women, and yet, you know, we have the case of Robert Picton, and I'm assuming in your case it wasn't Aboriginal men who did this. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I think that's really disrespectful. It's disrespectful to the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women because we don't know who the perpetrators are.
Now I feel for Beverly Jacobs. She lost her cousin. I cannot imagine how she feels. But what about her claims that we don't know who the perpetrators are? The solve rate for female Aboriginal murders is 88%. By the way, virtually the same solve rate for murdered non-Aboriginal women. By and large, we know who the killers are. They were caught. Now, do we know that these are Aboriginals committing the crimes? No, while the RCMP compiled a report of victimization based on race, they didn't reveal the race of the offender. But we do know that the victims knew their killer in 90% of the cases. So while some would like us to believe these are murders, these murders are the work of a mysterious serial killer preying on strangers, the numbers just don't back that up. Yes, Robert Picton is infamous. He's a monster. Whatever punishment we could inflict on Picton is insufficient for his horrific crimes. Can we say that it was domestic violence in all cases? No, but I'm sorry, domestic violence is undeniably a major factor here. Like I said, this is a difficult subject to discuss, and understandably so. The mainstream media are terrified of being labeled racist. If you don't believe the numbers, though, how about a personal testimony from an Aboriginal woman by the name of Joan Jack? In an op-ed published in the Winnipeg Free Press recently, here's what she wrote. Aboriginal men kill Aboriginal women and girls and rape Aboriginal women and girls, beat Aboriginal women and girls, and no one is really talking about the moose in our living room. If you stay home on reserve, you have a good chance of being killed, raped, or beaten by a fellow member of your community, likely someone you love deeply. And if you leave home, well, the statistics are showing it is highly likely you, as an Aboriginal woman or girl, will fall prey to the vultures that have been out there since contact, beating, raping, and killing our women. Joan, as an Aboriginal woman, is able to speak frankly when our largely white media won't. So we already know much of what's going wrong here, and yet the media and other politicians are relentless in their demand for a national public inquiry.
It just seems to me that if these were white women that were being killed at 1,200, it's almost 1,200, if these were white women, that we would have a national inquiry, that the police would have known a long time ago the numbers. We only found out last year that for the longest period of time we thought it was in the neighborhood of 600, and now the RCMP actually checked it out because of lobbying from people like you, and we found out there's almost 1,200. I mean, does that go to an almost institutional racism in this country, that we're not dealing with something that is looking us right in our eyes?
It's most definitely.
Other than spending millions of dollars in employing a bunch of lawyers, what would an inquiry actually accomplish? It would, of course, be a venue for groups and individuals to express their grievances. A public inquiry allows politicians to claim that they're doing something about a very difficult issue while actually doing nothing. But the left, of course, specializes in platitudes, as we know, and a thick, glossy report by a former judge would be hailed as a huge achievement. But in reality, it would probably confirm what we already know. Joan Jack is right. It's time to acknowledge the moose in the living room.